This is my basketball podcast, and today we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to be looking at the college basketball season, what's going on this past week, and instead of going day by day, I'm going to go conference by conference instead. A lot of good games in college basketball. Like I mentioned, there's something called Feast Week, a lot of good tournaments happening, so we'll get to all of that. So we're going to start in the Big Ten, and in the Big Ten, you got two teams that are undefeated right now. One being this Purdue team who played fantastic in Maui. They first started in a tough game against Gonzaga where they played good. Then they took on Tennessee where they ended up winning that game in the semifinals. And then they took on Marquette in the finals and they beat that team as well. So 3 straight wins against really, really good schools for this Purdue team. Zach Edey looks unstoppable. They were able to close out these games. All these games are pretty decently close, within 10 points at least for all of them, and Purdue was able to close them out and take the win for all of them. So great wins for Purdue. These are going to look amazing on their resume. And the second undefeated team is this Nebraska team, which isn't much as exciting. They haven't played anyone good. Their best team that they played is Oregon State, so we'll wait until they play good competition. They play Creighton this week, so they're definitely going to play some good competition. Now, a team that really impressed me this week was this Ohio State team. They were in a tournament where first they took on Alabama, number 17th ranked team in the country, and they ended up winning that game pretty dominantly. They ended up winning by 11 points, 81-92 was the final score. And then they took on a Santa Clara team that beat Oregon and ended up winning that game as well by 30 points. They ended up winning. So a good week for this Ohio State team. Ohio State's only loss is against a really good Texas A&M team, so nothing to be a bit sad about that there. But 2 good wins for this Ohio State team. Minnesota ended up dropping a game this week against Missouri. Minnesota looks like a pretty bad team this year. They haven't been playing well, and even in their easy win games, they've been having some trouble in those as well. Iowa had a loss to Oklahoma this week, but then came back the day after and ended up winning against Seton Hall. Iowa looks like a decent team. They competed against Creighton earlier in the season, and now they beat Seton Hall, so some good wins. They'll take on Purdue on December 4th, so that'll be in a week or so, so that's going to be a good game for sure to watch. And at the bottom of this conference, you have this Michigan State team who, nothing to be sad about here. I mean, Michigan State's played some really tough opponents so far. They always load up the schedule in the non-conference. Their 3 losses aren't that bad. First, it had a loss to James Madison on the first day of the season, which James Madison is a ranked team now, but still not a great loss. Then they lost to Duke, no shame in that, and then now Arizona. So 3 losses against ranked teams, but I was hoping they'd win one of those, and unfortunately they couldn't get. They were close with Arizona the entire game. They actually had a lead with I think 2 or 3 minutes left, but ended up losing it late. So still, this Michigan State team has a lot of potential, and I like this team a lot. They played fantastic against Arizona, even though they lost. Like I said, they had the lead with 2 or 3 minutes left and almost closed the game out, but Arizona ended up coming back and winning by 6 points, 74-60. And the final team I want to mention in the Big Ten is this Wisconsin Badgers team. They had a really good week after they've been struggling a little bit, losing to Tennessee early in the season and then Providence. But this week they played Virginia and SMU in their tournament. They beat Virginia pretty handedly as well by 10 plus points, and then they took on SMU in the championship game of their event, and they ended up winning 69-61. So 2 solid wins for this Wisconsin team. So that's it for the Big Ten. Next we're gonna move on to the Big 12. Next we have the Big 12, where there are actually loads of undefeated teams in this conference, 6 to be exact. Now, there are some undefeated teams like Cincinnati and TCU who haven't really played any good teams, but you also have teams like BYU, who this week played NC State and Arizona State and beat them in comfortable fashion, ended up beating both these teams by double digits. They're now 6-0 and have looked impressive. Then you also have Baylor, who got a win against Florida this week. That was pretty close, but still got the win, and beat Oregon State this week, so 2 good wins for this Baylor team. They look pretty solid. Then you have Houston, who didn't really play anybody this week, but continued to be undefeated. And Oklahoma, who had 2 really good wins this week. One against Iowa, where they won handedly. And then you have USC, where they ended up winning against USC by 2 points, final score being 72-70 against a ranked USC team that has been playing pretty decently recently. So 2 really good solid wins for this Oklahoma school. They look pretty good. Now we move down to the middle of the conference. We have Iowa State, who took a loss to Virginia Tech this week. Kansas, who I mentioned earlier, who lost in the semifinals to Marquette. They actually were down in that game for most of the game, and in the second half they were down as I think as much as like 17 or 18 points, but they ended up losing by 13 points. Then they rebounded the day after in the third place game of their tournament versus Tennessee, where they ultimately won that game. It was pretty close, but it was a good win for this Kansas team. Next, you have Texas, who their only loss against is against a really good UConn team. They struggled against Louisville, but they were able to come back and play pretty decently against this UConn team, only losing by 10 points, which UConn is really, really good. They then beat Wyoming on Sunday handedly, so some good wins for this Texas team. Just that UConn loss kind of hurts them. That would have put them in the top 5 for sure. Then you have Texas Tech, who took a loss to Villanova, but rebounded, beating Northern Iowa and then beating Michigan, which is a good win for this Texas Tech school. Michigan has been kind of stumbling. I forgot to mention that in the Big Ten when I was talking about the Big Ten. But Michigan recently has been really struggling. They lost to Memphis in their tournament, and then they lose to Texas Tech. So 2 pretty bad losses for this Michigan school. Even though these Memphis and Texas Tech are really good teams, still Michigan was playing really good and I had a bunch of potential for them. I thought they were going to play extremely well this season, but kind of disappointing so far. Then you have UCF, who's 4-1, and their only loss is against a really good Miami school. No shame in that. Kansas State, who beat Central Arkansas this week and is 4-2 so far. And then you have the Oklahoma State and West Virginia, the 2 worst teams in the conference so far, with 3 losses each. Oklahoma State has been playing really poorly recently. They've rebounded a little bit with 2 straight wins, but they've had some bad losses against Abilene Christian, St. Bonaventure, and Notre Dame, which Notre Dame is not a very good team this year. In West Virginia, kind of the same thing. They've had some pretty bad losses as well, losing to Monmouth. SMU and Virginia were not bad losses, but still, I thought they could have come out there with 1 win, but unfortunately they couldn't. So that's the Big 12. A lot of good teams. There are some bad teams in the conference, but some more good teams than bad teams. This is going to be a really solid conference this year, but so far it's been exciting. Next, we move on to the ACC, where we have 2 undefeated teams in this conference with Clemson and Miami. Miami definitely looks like the best team in this conference so far. I've been really impressed with how they've been playing. They've beaten up on some really good teams. Kansas State, they won pretty well. Georgia, they beat. UCF, they beat pretty handedly. They'll take on Kentucky on Tuesday of this week, so that's going to be definitely a game to watch. But they've played some decent teams, and they've not been startled. So some good wins for Miami, and they start 5-0. And Clemson has really surprised me this season. Even though they haven't played anyone great, they've just been winning their games. UAB and Davidson were some really tough teams they played in their tournament. Then they beat Boise State, who was undefeated going into that game, but they beat them pretty handedly, 85-68. So Clemson looks really solid as well. Then obviously in this conference you have North Carolina and Duke. Duke's only losses to Arizona, and no shame in that. Arizona, a really good team. And North Carolina's only loss came this week in overtime versus Villanova. But they did rebound with a win against a ranked Arkansas team. So, and then obviously you have Duke and North Carolina in this conference, which Duke didn't really play anyone that hard this week. They took on Southern Indiana and got the win. And North Carolina was in their tournament. I think it was the Battle for Atlantis, and they took on Northern Iowa on the first day, which they beat pretty handedly. Then they took on Villanova, which they had to take to overtime, but ended up falling in overtime and losing by 2 points in that one. But still a good showing from this North Carolina team. And on day 3 in the tournament, they rebounded in the third place game where they beat Arkansas pretty handily, actually. I think they beat them by 10 plus, yeah. 87-82 was the final score in that game. So pretty good showing in that tournament for North Carolina. And as we move down to the bottom of this conference, a little bit to the middle and the bottom, you have Virginia, who took the loss to Wisconsin, but is still ranked for now. And then you have Pitt, actually, which is a bit surprising. I didn't see Pitt being this good, but they're 5-1 and they're lost against Florida, which is basically the only good team they've played so far. So I think the big teams are definitely in this conference are definitely Clemson, Miami, Duke, and North Carolina. I think that's what found out this week. I do think there's a chance that Clemson does, end up losing the streak and falling to the middle or the bottom of the conference, which they've done a couple times. But I also like this Virginia team as well. Even though they lost to Wisconsin, they rebounded with a win against West Virginia. But I think those are the main teams in this conference. And as you get down to the bottom of this conference, there's a lot of teams that aren't very good. You got Boston College, even though they're off to a 4-2 start, which is decent. They have kept it close with a couple teams. Syracuse, which isn't a great school, and Notre Dame, who's had some trouble. You got Georgia Tech, Louisville, and Wake Forest, a team that I didn't expect to see at the bottom of this conference this early, has lost. They have played some decent teams, but they've lost, to LSU, Georgia, Utah, which they should have won. I think two out of three of those games, but unfortunately they weren't able to get any of those wins. But like I mentioned, top 5 teams in the conference are definitely this: Clemson, Miami, Duke, North Carolina, and Virginia. Next, I want to talk about the Big East. This was a big week in this conference, and some of the teams that played really well were Villanova for sure. They got 3 straight wins this week against 3 really good teams in Texas Tech, North Carolina, and Memphis. Those are 3 big wins for this program, and I see them as a threat in this conference for sure. And then obviously Marquette, who beat Kansas this week, did end up falling to Purdue in the final of their tournament, but still an amazing win against Kansas. And UConn, who remains undefeated after they beat Indiana and Texas in their tournament. Now the big loss in this conference, the big upset in this conference, was this Creighton versus Colorado State, which is a game that I was expecting Creighton to dominate, but it was a complete opposite. Colorado State absolutely dominated this game, ended up winning 69-48. Colorado State did, and handed Creighton, the number 8th ranked team in the country, their first loss, which was extremely surprising. Isaiah Stevens for the Colorado State team played good. He had 20 points. That's Colorado State's star player, and this Creighton team wasn't able to get anything going. Ryan Cockburner, Creighton's main guy, only had 12 points in this game, and the shots weren't falling. A lot of people on the Creighton team were not able to get many good shots. Trey Alexander, one of Creighton's stars, went 1 for 16 from the field. So even though Creighton lost this game big time against a team I wasn't expecting them to lose to, I still think they still have some potential. I feel like it was just an off night for them. Hopefully they can, come back. They take on Creighton plays Oklahoma State this week, so hopefully they can win that game at least. But still a bit of a surprise in this conference. So the 4 main teams are definitely UConn, Villanova, Creighton, and Marquette. And then you kind of get to the middle of the conference. You have Providence, a good team. Butler, a pretty decent team as well. Almost beating Florida Atlantic, and then coming back and blowing out Penn State and Boise State. So some good wins for Butler this week. And then you also have St. John's and Seton Hall, some decent teams as well. But the 4 main teams, like I mentioned, UConn, Villanova, Creighton, Marquette, all played pretty strong this week except for that Creighton loss. But I'm sure they'll be back and will play better. Next, we go to the Pac-12. We're at the top of this conference, and the only undefeated team in this conference is this Arizona Wildcats team. At 6-0, they've beaten some good teams. They played Michigan State this week, like I mentioned, where they won by 6 points. Next, you have Colorado, actually ranked number 18th in the country. They did take a pretty bad loss to a pretty bad Florida State team this week. They did follow that up with a win against Iona, though, but that loss against Florida State was not great for them. You got Washington State, who took a loss last week against Mississippi State, but they played Utah Tech this week and were able to get the win there. You got Oregon, who did not play good this week. They lost to Santa Clara and lost to Alabama. They should have beaten Santa Clara in the first place. Losing to Alabama is understandable, but they definitely should have beat Santa Clara. You got UCLA, who played pretty decent this week, even though they only went 1-2 in their tournament. They only lost to Marquette by 2 points, which is really good. I mean, they play a complete different style of play they play a complete different style of basketball than Marquette, but they still competed. And against Gonzaga, they only lost by 4 points. So UCLA looks like a really good team, and they have some pretty good games coming up against Nova. They play Ohio State, so we'll see them there. But 4-2 so far, and their 2 losses are against really good teams. And of course, you got USC, who lost. They have a loss to UC Irvine, where they lost a couple weeks ago, and now they have this loss to Oklahoma. 2 respectable losses, but still, as you're ranked number 23rd in the country, you should be able to beat, especially you said, UC Irvine. The rest of the conference is pretty, you got Cal at the bottom, not great. Stanford, Oregon State, those are probably the 3 worst teams. one team that's really surprised me so far in this conference is definitely this Washington team. They played really good against a pretty solid Xavier team. They only lost by, or actually they ended up winning this game by 3 points. Sorry, I got that a little mixed up. And then they played San Diego State, where they actually took it to overtime, and they ended up losing by 3 points. But still, they didn't play any games this week. But I'm really impressed with this Washington team. All right, so that is it. I went through all the 5 or 6 major conferences. Hopefully, when conference play starts, this will get easier because then I can just go conference by conference. But right now, it's a little, it's a little wild. I wasn't a big fan of this kind of style that I went to, but hopefully, I can make it better next episode. Thank you for listening to this episode. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody, and enjoy.